The sound of shattering crystal punctuated the sudden silence that fell over the grand ballroom of the Monarch Hotel. Elise Thorne, with coffee staining her once pristine white uniform, stared in horror at the fragments of what had been a $50,000 champagne flute scattered across the marble floor. Above her towered Damian Blackwood, the infamous tech titan whose net worth had just crossed into 13-digit territory that morning. His steel gray eyes held nothing but contempt. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" His voice was soft, almost gentle, making the venom in his words all the more potent. "That glass was older than your entire family line." The gathered elite of New York's high society watched with a mixture of fascination and discomfort. No one moved to help the young woman, whose hands now trembled uncontrollably. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Blackwood, it was an accident," Elise began, her voice barely audible. "An accident?" Damian gave a cold laugh that sent shivers down her spine. "No, an accident is what happens when competent people make rare mistakes. This," he gestured at the mess, "is the inevitable result of allowing someone of your station to serve in a place like this." The words cut deeper than any blade could. Elise's cheeks burned with humiliation as whispers rippled through the crowd. She had taken this catering job to pay for her final semester of medical school, one shift to cover a month's rent. Now, it would cost her far more. "My station?" she repeated, something sparking in her hazel eyes that made Damian narrow his own. "Yes, your station," he said, leaning closer. "Some people are meant to build empires, others to clean up after them. I suggest you get a broom and remember which category you fall into." What happened next became the stuff of Manhattan legend. Elise straightened her shoulders and looked directly into the eyes of the most powerful man in the room. "I know exactly who I am, Mr. Blackwood. The question is, do you?" She removed her apron with deliberate care, placed it on a nearby table, and walked out of the ballroom with a dignity that made several guests lower their gazes in shame. Damian watched her go, an unfamiliar sensation settling in his chest. It took him a moment to recognize it as respect, quickly crushed beneath the weight of his ego. "Someone clean this up," he commanded, turning back to his admiring circle, already forgetting the face of the woman who had dared to challenge him. But 5 years would pass, and on a rain-slicked street in Lower Manhattan, fate would ensure that Damian Blackwood would remember Elise Thorne with crystal clarity. Because empires rise and fall, and sometimes, so do emperors. Thunder rolled across the Manhattan skyline as Damian Blackwood's sleek Bentley crawled through unexpected traffic. He drummed his fingers impatiently against the leather armrest, checking his watch for the third time in as many minutes. "I'm going to miss this meeting, Lawrence," he snapped at his driver. "Find another route." "There's been an accident ahead, sir. Emergency services are blocking all lanes." Damian cursed under his breath. The Monarch Medical Center was about to announce its new chief of emergency medicine, and he was the primary benefactor who had made the expansion possible. His absence would be noted, his power momentarily diminished. "Pull over, I'll walk the remaining blocks." "But sir, the rain." "Now." Moments later, Damian stepped onto the glistening sidewalk, his Italian shoes immediately soaked by a puddle. The downpour intensified as if taking personal delight in his discomfort. He moved swiftly, dodging other pedestrians, his custom umbrella battling against the wind. That's when he saw her. She was kneeling beside a homeless man who had collapsed against a building, her hands moving with practiced precision as she checked his vitals. Her medical bag lay open beside her, and despite the rain soaking through her clothes, her focus remained unbroken. Something about her arrested Damian's movement. A half-forgotten memory tugged at his consciousness. Then she looked up, calling to a bystander to dial 911, and Damian saw her face clearly. 5 years had passed, but those hazel eyes remained unchanged. Dr. Elise Thorne didn't notice him standing there. She was too busy saving a life. The ceremony had already begun when Damian finally arrived, water dripping from his coat despite efforts to dry himself. He took his seat on the stage, half listening to the hospital director's speech. His mind remained outside in the rain, with a woman who had once walked away from him with her dignity intact. And so it gives me great pleasure to introduce our new Chief of Emergency Medicine, a doctor whose groundbreaking research on trauma care in underserved communities has revolutionized our approach. Please welcome Dr. Elise Thorne. Damien's Eeyore head snapped up as applause filled the auditorium. Through the stage entrance she appeared, the same woman from the street, now dry and composed in a professional blazer, her auburn hair pulled back in a neat bun. Their eyes met across the stage. A flicker of recognition crossed her features before her expression cooled to professional neutrality. She approached the podium without acknowledging him further. "Thank you, Director Phillips. I'm honored to accept this position and the responsibility it entails." Her voice carried the same quiet confidence that had haunted Damien for 5 years. As she outlined her vision for the emergency department, emphasizing equal care regardless of patients' financial status, he found himself genuinely listening. Not analyzing for weakness or calculating advantage as he typically did, just listening. When she finished her speech, Damien joined the standing ovation mechanically, his mind racing. The universe had a perverse sense of humor. The woman he had humiliated was now in charge of a department bearing his name. Later at the reception, he approached her deliberately. She saw him coming and excused herself from conversation with a colleague. "Dr. Thorne," he said, extending his hand. "Congratulations on your appointment." "Mr. Blackwood." Her handshake was firm but brief. "Thank you for your generous donation to the hospital." No mention of their previous encounter. No indication that she remembered the young catering assistant who had walked away from his cruelty, but they both knew. "I hope we can work closely together. I have some ideas for the emergency department," he said. Elise's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Of course, my assistant can schedule a meeting." She turned to leave, but Damien caught her arm gently. "You don't remember me, do you?" The look she gave him could have frozen fire. "I remember everything, Mr. Blackwood, including who holds the broom now." She walked away, leaving him standing alone in a crowded room for the second time in their acquaintance. And for the second time, Damien Blackwood found himself reluctantly impressed. "Your department is hemorrhaging money, Dr. Thorne." Damien's voice echoed in the hospital boardroom as he gestured at the spreadsheet displayed on the screen. $3 million over budget in just 4 months. Elise remained unfazed, watching him pace like a caged predator. The monthly oversight meeting had turned into an ambush, with board members shifting uncomfortably in their seats as the hospital's primary benefactor systematically dismantled her emergency department's financial performance. "Those aren't expenses, Mr. Blackwood, they're investments," she replied, her tone level. "Every dollar you see there represents lives saved." Damien scoffed. "Poetic, but hardly practical. This institution needs to remain solvent to help anyone." "Then perhaps you should have donated to a bank instead of a hospital." The tension in the room crystallized. Director Phillips cleared his throat nervously, attempting to intervene, but Damien raised a hand to silence him. "Could you all give Dr. Thorne and me the room, please?" It wasn't a request. The board members filed out, some casting sympathetic glances at Elise, who remained seated, her posture betraying nothing of the fury building inside her. When the door closed, Damien took the seat across from her. "What game are you playing?" he asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. "Medicine isn't a game to me." "Everything's a game. You're just losing this one." He leaned forward. "You've implemented experimental trauma protocols without board approval, hired staff beyond your allocated headcount, and ordered equipment that wasn't budgeted. It's almost as if you're deliberately trying to provoke me." Elise finally allowed herself to show emotion, her eyes flashing dangerously. "Not everything revolves around you, Damien. Those experimental protocols have reduced mortality rates by 27%. Those excess staff members mean patients aren't dying in hallways. That unnecessary equipment detected a brain hemorrhage in a 4-year-old last week that would have been missed otherwise." She pushed a folder across the table. "Here are the outcomes you won't see on your precious spreadsheets." Damien didn't. Open the folder. You know I could have you removed with one phone call. You could, she acknowledged. But you won't. And why is that? Because despite everything, you're not actually the monster you pretend to be. The words hung between them, unexpected and disarming. Damien's carefully constructed facade cracked ever so slightly. You don't know me. I know you visited the pediatric ward 6 times after hours when you thought no one would notice, Elise said quietly. I know you sat with the homeless man I was treating that day in the rain until his sister arrived, the same man you later arranged housing for. Damien's expression hardened. Having me followed is beneath you, doctor. I didn't have to. Hospital security cameras don't lie, and nurses talk. She stood, gathering her papers. Your money built this wing, but it's your actions when you think no one is watching that interest me. She moved to leave, but Damien's voice stopped her. My father died in an emergency room much like yours, he said, the words emerging as if pulled from some deep wounded place. The doctor said they were too busy to see him immediately. A janitor found him an hour later. He'd had an aortic dissection. Elise turned slowly. I didn't know. How could you? It's not in any biography or interview. His laugh was hollow. Damien Blackwood built an empire from nothing after losing everything. Makes for a better story than the truth. Which is that I've spent 20 years building wealth to ensure no hospital would ever prioritize finances over a patient again. He finally opened the folder she'd given him, examining the statistics and patient outcomes. And here you are, running my emergency department into financial ruin to save people who can't pay. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Elise returned to the table, sitting beside him rather than across. Let me show you something. She turned pages until she reached a photograph of a young girl. This is Mia, 10 years old. Her parents are undocumented. They waited 3 days before bringing her in because they were afraid of deportation. By then, her appendix had ruptured. She turned another page. This is Mia now back in school because we didn't turn her family away. Page after page, she showed him the human beings behind the numbers. Eventually, Damien closed the folder, his expression unreadable. I still think you're being financially reckless, he said finally. And I still think you're being needlessly cruel, she countered. But perhaps we're both wrong about each other. Thunder rumbled outside, echoing the unspoken tension in the room. When Damien spoke again, his voice had lost its cutting edge. Have dinner with me tonight. Elise blinked, caught off guard. Excuse me? Dinner, a neutral location. We discuss how to make this department sustainable without compromising care. He stood, straightening his tie. Unless you're afraid to face me outside these walls, Dr. Thorne. The challenge hung in the air between them. Fine, she said eventually. But I choose the restaurant. A hint of a genuine smile touched Damien's lips. I wouldn't have it any other way. As he left the boardroom, neither of them acknowledged the subtle shift that had occurred, a first fragile bridge spanning the chasm between their worlds. Outside, the storm intensified, washing away the boundaries they had both so carefully constructed. Elise's choice of restaurant wasn't what Damien expected. No Michelin stars, no exclusive reservations, not even a proper wine list. Just a small, family-owned Italian place in Queens where the owner greeted her by name and kissed both her cheeks. Marco lost his health insurance after his factory closed, she explained as they were seated in a quiet corner. The hospital wrote off his bypass surgery. Now I never pay for tiramisu here. Damien observed her in this environment, relaxed, genuine, wearing a simple blue dress that complemented her eyes far better than the formal hospital attire. Here, away from the sterile walls of the hospital, she was even more captivating. You make a habit of dining in establishments owned by your patients? He asked, studying the humble menu. I make a habit of remaining connected to the community I serve, she corrected him. Something your quarterly reports don't measure. The familiar tension threatened to resurface, but Damien surprised her by setting down his menu and folding his hands. Let's establish new ground rules for tonight, he proposed. No hospital talk, no budgets, no past grievances. Elise raised an eyebrow. Then what exactly would we discuss, Mr. Blackwood? Damien, he corrected. And we could start with why someone brilliant enough to have her pick of prestigious positions chose emergency medicine in an underfunded hospital. Their conversation flowed unexpectedly from there. Elise spoke of growing up with a single mother who worked 3 jobs, of the community clinic doctor who had treated her asthma for free, inspiring her career path. Damien shared stories of his early business failures, the mentor who had believed in him when no one else would. The simple food arrived unpretentious and delicious. Damien found himself laughing genuinely for the first time in years at Elise's animated retelling of her medical school disasters. Your turn, she said, taking a sip of wine. Tell me something no one knows about the great Damien Blackwood. He hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn poker chip. I carry this everywhere. It was my father's lucky charm. He was going to use it at a casino the weekend after he died. Elise gently took the chip, examining it. This is why you built the hospital wing, isn't it? I told you. No hospital talk, he reminded her, but there was no edge to his words. It's not about the hospital. It's about you. She returned the chip, her fingers brushing his. The man who publicly humiliated me 5 years ago would never carry a sentimental token. Perhaps that man never existed. Perhaps it was just armor. The confession hung between them like delicate crystal, fragile and valuable. After dinner, they walked through a small neighborhood park, the spring air cool, but pleasant. Neither seemed eager to end the evening. Why did you really ask me to dinner? Elise finally asked, stopping beside a small fountain. Damien considered his answer carefully. Because you're the only person who's seen through me twice. First when you walked away from me at that gala, and again in the boardroom today. That's not an answer. It's the most honest one I have. He turned to face her directly. I've spent my life building walls no one could scale. You walked through them as if they weren't there. Elise studied his face, searching for deception and finding none. And what happens tomorrow? We go back to being adversaries over budget spreadsheets? No, Damien said with quiet certainty. Tomorrow I transfer an additional $50 million to the emergency department's endowment, with one condition. Her expression cooled immediately. I don't accept bribes, even philanthropic ones. The condition is that you use it however you see fit, he continued, unfazed by her assumption. No oversight committees, no quarterly reviews, just your judgment, which I've come to trust more than my own in these matters. Elise stared at him in disbelief. Why would you do that? Because some debts can't be repaid with money alone. He took a step closer. 5 years ago, I tried to put you in your place. I was wrong about what that place was. The weight of that moment, the apology embedded in his words, settled around them like a mantle. And what about us? She asked quietly. Is this guilt? Attraction? A game to conquer the one person who stood up to you? I don't know, Damien admitted, the uncertainty foreign on his lips. But I'd like to find out if you're willing. Elise didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached into her purse and pulled out a small fragment of crystal, the broken piece from the champagne flute from 5 years ago. I kept this, she confessed. Not as a reminder to hate you, but as a promise to myself never to be silenced again. She placed it in his palm, closing his fingers around it. I'm not the same woman who walked away that night. I'm counting on that, Damien said, his voice rough with emotion. Because I'm not the same man either. The fountain bubbled quietly beside them as Elise made her decision. She leaned forward and pressed her lips gently against his, a tentative first step across the final boundary between them. When she pulled away, Damien's expression had transformed, vulnerability replacing the armor he'd worn for decades. Does this mean you accept my funding proposal, Dr. Thorne? He asked, a hint of his old arrogance returning, though now softened with affection. It means I accept the possibility of us. She corrected him. The rest will negotiate. I'm still expecting those quarterly reports. Damien laughed, the sound unburdened and real. I wouldn't have it any other way. As they walked hand in hand through the park, neither knew exactly what tomorrow would bring. But for two people who had spent their lives planning every detail, the uncertainty felt strangely like freedom. In the end, it wasn't about the fall of a mighty empire or the rise of an underdog. It was simpler than that. Two people who had finally found someone who could see beyond their carefully constructed facades, someone who could challenge them to be better versions of themselves. And sometimes that was victory enough.
The rain lashed against the wide windows of St. John's Hospital, its rhythmic tapping blending with the steady hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Caroline Carter pulled her scrubs tighter around her frame, her fingers absently adjusting the badge clipped to her pocket. It was her third double shift this week, and exhaustion clung to her like a heavy blanket. But even the weight of fatigue couldn't dull the hollow ache that had settled in her chest since her divorce 6 months ago. She glanced at the clock hanging above the nurse's station. Almost midnight. The ER had been surprisingly quiet, the kind of silence that felt like a prelude to chaos. Caroline had just begun to relax when the piercing wail of ambulance sirens shattered the stillness. Her muscles tensed instinctively. "Caroline!" Janet Mills, her colleague and closest friend, appeared by her side, holding a clipboard. "Ambulance just pulled in, multiple injuries and—" Janet paused, her tone shifting to something conspiratorial. "You'll never guess who's in the mix." Caroline frowned. "Please don't say another drunk college kid trying to skateboard off a rooftop." Janet smirked. "Not this time. They're bringing in Lucas Sinclair." The name hit her like a bolt of electricity. Everyone in Seattle knew who Lucas Sinclair was. Tech genius, billionaire, the man who had built an empire from scratch and whose face had graced the covers of countless magazines. But Lucas was as infamous for his reclusive nature as he was for his brilliance. Stories of his rare public appearances and eccentric behavior often fueled tabloid speculation, including the whispers about his unusual condition, an allergy to physical touch. Caroline barely had time to process Janet's words before the ER doors burst open, paramedics wheeling in a gurney. Her eyes locked on the figure lying motionless under the harsh glow of the overhead lights. His dark hair was matted with blood, and his tailored suit was torn and stained. Even in this disheveled state, there was no mistaking him. Lucas Sinclair was as striking in person as he was on magazine covers. "Car accident," one of the paramedics reported as they maneuvered the gurney into position. "Skidded on black ice. Minor injuries, but he lost consciousness at the scene." The charge nurse barked orders, and Caroline quickly fell into step with the team, her training overriding any hesitation. As they moved Lucas to a private room, she couldn't help but steal a glance at his face. There was something unsettling about seeing someone so powerful rendered so vulnerable. Once inside the room, Caroline worked methodically, gathering supplies to clean his wounds. The charge nurse handed her a clipboard and gave her a curt nod. "You're up, Carter. Follow protocol. He's sedated, so he shouldn't give you any trouble." Caroline swallowed hard, a flicker of unease creeping up her spine. She'd dealt with difficult patients before, but the idea of caring for someone like Lucas Sinclair, someone who lived in a world so far removed from hers, felt like stepping into uncharted territory. The quiet hum of the machines filled the room as Caroline began her work. Her gloved hands moved with practiced precision, cleaning the dried blood from his forehead and dabbing antiseptic onto the shallow cuts along his cheek. Up close, he looked different from the polished, untouchable figure she'd imagined. There was a vulnerability to him, etched into the lines around his eyes and the faint shadow of stubble on his jaw. Halfway through her task, Lucas stirred. His eyelids fluttered open, and for a moment, his stormy grey eyes met hers. Caroline froze, the cloth in her hand suspended mid-air. "Where?" His voice was hoarse, barely audible. "Where am I?" "You're at St. John's Hospital," she said gently, willing her voice to remain calm. "You were in an accident, but you're safe now." Lucas's gaze shifted downward, noticing the damp cloth in her hand. A flicker of panic flashed across his face. "Don't!" he rasped, his body tensing. "Don't touch me." Caroline immediately stepped back, raising her hands in a gesture of surrender. "I'm sorry," she said softly, her voice steady, despite the tension thickening the air. "You had some injuries that needed cleaning. I was just following protocol. I'll stop." Lucas's breathing quickened, his chest rising and falling in shallow bursts. For a moment, Caroline feared he might hyperventilate. His hands gripped the edges of the hospital bed, his knuckles whitening as if he were bracing against an unseen storm. "I need you to take a few deep breaths," she urged gently, keeping her distance. "You're safe here. I won't touch you again unless it's absolutely necessary." It took a moment, but Lucas's breathing began to slow, his shoulders relaxing slightly. His sharp gaze turned back to her, suspicion mingling with something she couldn't quite place. Fear, perhaps, or shame. "Your condition," she said cautiously, not wanting to push him too far. "I've heard about it. I understand if this is hard for you." His eyes narrowed, the vulnerability vanishing behind a defensive glare. "You don't understand," he said curtly, his voice low but steady. "No one does." Caroline held his gaze, refusing to back down. "Maybe not," she admitted. "But I do know that everyone deserves compassion, Mr. Sinclair, even you." For a fleeting moment, something in his expression softened, a crack in the armor. But just as quickly, the walls went back up. He leaned back against the pillows, his jaw tightening as though the conversation had already exhausted him. "Compassion," he muttered, almost to himself. "That's a new one." Caroline chose to ignore the bitterness in his tone. Instead, she busied herself tidying the supplies, giving him space to process whatever storm was raging inside him. She had seen patients react to trauma in countless ways, but there was something uniquely isolating about Lucas Sinclair's demeanor. It wasn't just the physical barrier his condition imposed, it was the emotional distance he seemed to enforce, as if the very idea of connection was a threat. As she reached the door to leave, his voice stopped her. "Wait!" She turned back, surprised to see hesitation flickering across his face. "What's your name?" he asked. "Caroline," she replied. "Caroline Carter." Lucas nodded slowly, as if committing the name to memory. "Thank you," he said, the words simple yet weighted, as if they carried more meaning than he intended to show. Caroline offered a faint smile before stepping out and closing the door quietly behind her. In the hallway, the usual hum of hospital life continued, heels clicking against tile floors, pages beeping in the distance. But Caroline's thoughts were far from routine. She couldn't shake the intensity of her interaction with Lucas Sinclair. Beneath the cold demeanor and guarded eyes, there was something else, something fragile and raw. "Hey!" Janet's voice pulled her from her reverie as she approached the nurse's station. "How's our billionaire doing? Did he bite your head off yet?" Caroline exhaled a soft laugh, shaking her head. "Not quite, but it was close." Janet arched a brow, curiosity sparkling in her eyes. "So? What's he like?" Caroline hesitated, her mind replaying the moments in the room. "Complicated," she finally said, "and not at all what I expected." Janet smirked. "Well, that sounds like a story I'm dying to hear later. But for now, you'd better pace yourself. Something tells me Mr. Sinclair isn't going anywhere anytime soon." Caroline nodded, her thoughts drifting back to the man lying behind the closed door. Janet was right. Lucas Sinclair wasn't like any patient she'd encountered before. And though she couldn't explain it, Caroline had a strange feeling that this was only the beginning of something far more complicated than she was prepared for. The morning light filtered through the blinds of Lucas Sinclair's private room, casting soft shadows on the sterile white walls. Caroline stood just outside the door, reviewing his chart for any updates. According to the night staff, Lucas had barely slept and had refused any offers of pain medication. Typical, she thought. Patients like him, used to control, accustomed to calling the shots, rarely knew how to surrender to the vulnerability of healing. She pushed the door open quietly, not wanting to disturb him if he had finally drifted off. But Lucas was wide awake, sitting upright in bed, his storm-grey eyes fixed on the window. His posture was stiff, his hands resting tensely on his lap, as if he were bracing himself for another fight. "Good morning, Mr. Sinclair," Caroline said with professional cheer, stepping inside. "How are you feeling?" Lucas didn't respond immediately. His gaze remained locked on the skyline outside, the faint outlines of Seattle's iconic Space Needle visible through the window. Finally he spoke, his voice low and measured. "I'm fine." Caroline suppressed a sigh. She'd heard that line enough times to know it rarely meant anything more than a polite dismissal. Still, she approached his bedside, determined to stick to protocol even if he made her job harder than it needed to be. "I need to check your vitals," she informed him, setting the clipboard down on the small table beside the bed. "And don't worry, I'll do my best not to intrude on your personal space." The comment earned her a quick glance, his expression unreadable. "I'm sure you will," he muttered dryly. Caroline ignored the jab, wrapping the blood pressure cuff around his arm with careful precision. As the cuff tightened, she noticed the way his jaw clenched and his breathing slowed, as though he were willing himself not to react. It was a subtle but telling sign, one she'd seen before in patients who carried more emotional scars than physical ones. "You know," she said lightly, hoping to ease the tension, "most people don't come out of a car accident with just a few scrapes. You're lucky." "Lucky," Lucas echoed, his tone bitter. "That's one way to look at it." Caroline hesitated, glancing up at him. There was an edge to his voice, a heaviness that hinted at something deeper. She wanted to ask what he meant, but decided against it. Whatever burden Lucas was carrying, it wasn't her place to pry. Not yet, at least. Once she'd finished checking his vitals, Caroline stepped back, giving him space. "Everything looks stable," she said, scribbling notes on the clipboard. "But you should try to rest more. Recovery isn't just physical, you know." Lucas let out a short, humorless laugh. "I've heard that before." The conversation might have ended there, but Caroline couldn't ignore the undercurrent of pain in his words. She set the clipboard down, her curiosity getting the better of her. "I don't mean to overstep," she began carefully, "but it seems like there's a lot more going on here than just recovering from an accident." Lucas's eyes flicked to her, sharp and guarded. "I wasn't aware my nurse also doubled as a therapist." Caroline didn't flinch. Instead, she met his gaze evenly. "I'm just saying, If you ever need to talk, I'm here." The room fell silent, the air heavy with unspoken tension. For a moment, Lucas looked like he might respond, his lips parting as if to speak. But then he turned away, his focus drifting back to the window. "Thank you, Ms. Carter," he said finally, his voice colder than before. "But I think I'll manage." Caroline bit back the urge to press further. "Fair enough," she said quietly, collecting her supplies. "I'll check on you later." As she left the room, Caroline couldn't shake the feeling that Lucas Sinclair was hiding far more than he let on. Caroline walked back to the nurses' station, her thoughts still tangled around Lucas Sinclair. She had encountered difficult patients before, but there was something uniquely impenetrable about him. His walls weren't just high, they were fortified, built from years of isolation and carefully guarded secrets. She couldn't help but wonder what had driven him to construct them in the first place. "You've got that look," Janet said, leaning against the counter with a knowing smirk. "The one that says you're trying to figure someone out." Caroline set down her clipboard, exhaling a long breath. "He's complicated," Janet chuckled. "Understatement of the year. But hey, at least he's not throwing things or screaming at anyone. That's progress for some of the VIPs we get." Caroline nodded absently, her gaze drifting toward Lucas's closed door. "It's not just his attitude. It's like he's carrying something heavier than what we're seeing, something bigger than just the accident." Janet raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "You think it's related to all that tabloid gossip? The allergy thing? Or maybe his family drama? I mean, the Sinclair name's practically a soap opera." "I don't know," Caroline admitted. "But whatever it is, it's eating at him." Before Janet could reply, the sound of footsteps and a clipped, authoritative voice drew their attention. A woman in an impeccably tailored suit strode through the hallway, her heels clicking sharply against the tile. Caroline recognized her immediately, Ruth Sinclair, Lucas's sister. Her striking resemblance to Lucas was hard to miss, from the same piercing grey eyes to the air of detached confidence she carried. "Excuse me," Ruth said, her tone curt as she approached the nurses' station. "I'm here to see my brother." "Which room?" Janet opened her mouth to respond, but Ruth's eyes locked on Caroline, narrowing slightly. "Ah, you must be the nurse assigned to him, Caroline Carter, correct?" Caroline nodded, bracing herself for whatever Ruth had to say. "That's right. Mr. Sinclair is in room 312. "Good," Ruth said briskly. "I'd like a moment with him. Alone." Caroline hesitated, her instincts prickling. There was something unnervingly sharp about Ruth's demeanor, like a blade hidden behind her polished exterior. "Of course," Caroline said carefully. "But if he needs anything—" "He won't," Ruth cut in, her smile thin and cold. "I'll make sure of it." Without another word, Ruth turned on her heel and strode toward Lucas's room, her heels echoing down the hallway. Janet let out a low whistle, leaning closer to Caroline. "She's a piece of work, huh?" Caroline didn't respond, her mind racing. Something about Ruth's presence felt wrong, like an unwelcome storm brewing on the horizon. She waited a few minutes, then found herself drifting toward Lucas's door, curiosity and concern propelling her forward. She lingered just outside, the muted sound of voices leaking through the crack. "You're being reckless, Lucas." Ruth's voice was sharp, laced with frustration. "Staying here only makes you look weak. The board is already questioning your judgment." "I don't care what they think," Lucas replied, his tone flat but firm. "I'm not leaving." "You're putting everything at risk," Ruth hissed. "Do you think this hospital gossip won't get back to the media, or worse, the shareholders?" Lucas's response was quieter, almost too soft to hear. "For once, Ruth, I'm doing what I want." Caroline's breath hitched at the raw defiance in his voice. She stepped away from the door, her heart pounding as she retreated to the nurses' station. Whatever was happening in that room, it was clear that Lucas Sinclair's troubles went far beyond the confines of his hospital bed. For the first time, Caroline wondered if she had stepped into something much larger than she was prepared to handle. Caroline adjusted the stethoscope around her neck as she returned to her rounds, trying to focus on the tasks at hand. But Ruth Sinclair's visit lingered in her mind like an uninvited guest. Lucas's sister had left shortly after their tense exchange, her heels clicking sharply as she disappeared down the hallway. Whatever she had said to Lucas had clearly left a mark. When Caroline checked his room shortly after, he was staring at the window, his expression grim and unreadable. "Miss Carter!" a voice called out, jolting her from her thoughts. She turned to see Janet rushing toward her, her face animated with excitement. "What is it?" Caroline asked, tensing. "Another emergency?" "You could say that," Janet replied, holding up her phone. "Have you seen this?" Caroline took the device hesitantly, her heart sinking as she read the headline splashed across the screen. "Reclusive billionaire Lucas Sinclair hospitalized. Mystery nurse sparks rumors." Below the headline was a blurry photo of her and Lucas in his room, taken through the window from outside the hospital. "What the?" Caroline began, her voice trailing off as she scrolled through the article. It was a speculative mess of assumptions and fabricated details, insinuating that she and Lucas were involved in some kind of scandalous affair. Janet winced. "It's already all over social media. You know how these things spread." Caroline felt a wave of nausea. "This is ridiculous. I was just doing my job." "Try explaining that to the internet," Janet said, her tone grim. "Or to the hospital board, for that matter." The thought made Caroline's stomach churn. Her position at St. John's was one of the few stable things in her life after her divorce, and now it was at risk because of a baseless rumor. She didn't have time to dwell on the implications, though, as the commotion outside the hospital suddenly caught her attention. She followed Janet to the front entrance, where a cluster of reporters had gathered, cameras flashing and microphones extended as they shouted questions to anyone who would listen. Security guards stood at the ready, trying to maintain order, but the frenzy showed no signs of slowing down. Caroline's pulse quickened as she scanned the crowd. "This is insane. Why would they even care?" Janet gave her a pointed look. "Because he's Lucas Sinclair. People love a scandal, especially when it involves a billionaire." As Caroline turned to retreat from the chaos, a voice behind her stopped her in her tracks. "Ms. Carter." She turned to see Mark Hampton, Lucas's lawyer, striding toward her with an air of practiced calm. His tailored suit and confident demeanor screamed professionalism, but his eyes held a sharp intensity that put Caroline on edge. "We need to talk," he said, gesturing for her to follow him. "Privately." Caroline hesitated but nodded, her instincts telling her this conversation wasn't optional. They stepped into an empty conference room, and Mark closed the door behind them with a soft click. "This situation," Mark began, his tone clipped, "is spiraling out of control. The media is speculating about your relationship with Mr. Sinclair. It's causing significant damage to his reputation and could have legal implications for the hospital." Caroline's frustration bubbled to the surface. "I don't have a relationship with him. I'm his nurse, nothing more." Mark raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "That may be true, but perception is everything. Right now, the perception is that you're involved with one of the most high-profile men in the city." He slid a piece of paper across the table toward her. "I need you to sign this. It's a non-disclosure agreement, effective immediately." Caroline stared at the document, her pulse pounding in her ears. "A non-disclosure agreement? Are you serious?" Mark's expression didn't waver. "Completely. This will protect both you and Mr. Sinclair from further scrutiny. It's standard procedure in situations like this." Caroline hesitated, her mind racing. Signing the NDA felt like admitting guilt, like she had something to hide. But refusing could potentially make things worse, for her and for Lucas. "I'll need some time to think about this," she said finally, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. Mark inclined his head. "Take all the time you need, but understand that time is a luxury we don't have." Caroline sat in the empty conference room for a moment after Mark left, staring at the NDA as if it might catch fire. Her chest felt tight, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She had never signed anything like this before, never even thought she'd be in a position where it was necessary. All she'd done was her job, and now her career, her reputation, and her peace of mind hung in the balance. With a heavy sigh, she folded the document and tucked it into her pocket. There was no way she was signing it without understanding exactly what it meant. She'd need to talk to someone, maybe even get legal advice, before making any decisions. For now, though, she had patients to tend to, and Lucas Sinclair wasn't going anywhere. When she stepped back into the hallway, the hospital felt different, tenser, heavier. The ripple effects of the media frenzy were already spreading. She caught fragments of hushed conversations between nurses, some sympathetic, others judgmental. Janet shot her a look as she passed, mouthing, "You okay?" Caroline gave a small nod but didn't stop to chat. She needed to focus. When she reached Lucas's room, she knocked lightly before entering. He was sitting on the edge of the bed this time, his posture rigid and his gaze fixed on the wall ahead. He didn't turn to look at her, but his voice was sharp when he spoke. "I assume you've seen the headlines." Caroline closed the door softly behind her, feeling the tension in the room like a physical force. "I have," she admitted, keeping her tone neutral. "It's not exactly the kind of attention I was hoping for." Lucas let out a dry laugh, though there was no humor in it. "Welcome to my world." Caroline crossed her arms, leaning back against the counter. "Your lawyer cornered me a little while ago, tried to get me to sign an NDA that got his attention." Lucas turned to her, his brows furrowed. "He did what?" "You didn't know?" she asked, surprised. "He said it was standard procedure, to protect both of us." Lucas's expression darkened, a flash of anger crossing his face. "I didn't authorize that." "Well, he seems to think it's necessary," Caroline replied, her voice edged with frustration. "And maybe he's right. I don't know how to handle something like this, Lucas. I'm just a nurse, not someone used to being in the spotlight." Her words hung in the air for a moment before Lucas spoke, his tone quieter now. "I'm sorry," he said, the sincerity in his voice catching her off guard. "This isn't fair to you. You didn't ask for any of this." Caroline studied him, noting the way his shoulders sagged slightly, the way his usual guarded expression softened. For all his wealth and influence, Lucas Sinclair looked tired, human, and that vulnerability struck a chord in her. "It's not your fault," she said after a beat. "But I need to know. Why are you still here? You could have left days ago, gone to some private facility far away from all this. Why stay?" Lucas hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. For a moment, Caroline thought he might deflect the question, but then he met her eyes, his voice low but steady. "Because I'm tired of running." The honesty in his words surprised her. She could see the weight behind them, the years of isolation and avoidance he must have endured. It wasn't just about the accident or the media, it was about something much deeper. Before she could respond, there was a sudden commotion outside the room. The muffled sound of raised voices and hurried footsteps drew both of their attention. Caroline frowned, stepping toward the door. "Stay here," she told Lucas firmly before slipping into the hallway. The scene outside was chaotic. A group of reporters had somehow breached hospital security and were advancing down the corridor, cameras flashing as they shouted questions. Caroline's heart sank as she spotted Janet and a few other nurses trying to hold them back, their voices drowned out by the cacophony. Caroline didn't think, she acted. She strode toward the group, her presence commanding enough to draw their attention. "This is a hospital!" she snapped, her voice firm and clear. "You're disrupting patient care. You need to leave immediately." One of the reporters turned to her, his camera trained on her face. "Miss Carter, is it true you've been romantically involved with Mr. Sinclair? Were you with him the night of the accident?" The question sent a ripple of anger through her, but she kept her composure. "I am a nurse. My job is to provide medical care, not commentary for your gossip columns. Now, if you don't leave, I'll be forced to call security." The reporter hesitated, clearly weighing his options, but before he could respond, a low, commanding voice cut through the chaos. "That won't be necessary." Caroline turned to see Lucas standing in the doorway of his room, his expression calm, but his tone leaving no room for argument. The reporters froze, their cameras swinging toward him like heat-seeking missiles. "Mr. Sinclair," one of them began, but Lucas held up a hand, silencing them. "This is a place of healing, not a spectacle," he said evenly. "If you have questions, they can wait. But if you don't leave right now, I'll ensure you never step foot in this hospital again." The authority in his voice was palpable, and within moments the reporters began retreating, their murmurs fading as they were escorted out by security. When the corridor finally cleared, Caroline let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Lucas approached her, his gaze steady. "I told you I wasn't going anywhere," he said quietly, "and I meant it." Caroline studied him for a moment, her frustration tempered by an unexpected sense of admiration. "You might have just made things worse," she said, though her tone lacked any real bite. "Maybe," Lucas admitted, "but at least now they know where I stand." And for the first time, Caroline felt like she was beginning to see who Lucas Sinclair really was. The tension in the air was palpable when Caroline entered Lucas's room later that afternoon. The confrontation with the reporters had left her emotionally drained, but she knew she needed to check on him. Lucas was seated by the window, his profile illuminated by the soft glow of the late afternoon sun. He seemed lost in thought, his hands clasped tightly together as if holding on to something invisible but precious. "You shouldn't have done that," Caroline said quietly, closing the door behind her. Lucas glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "Done what?" "Confronted the reporters," she replied, crossing her arms. "You just gave them more fuel. Now they know exactly where to find you." A ghost of a smile touched his lips, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I've dealt with the press my whole life. This is nothing new." Caroline frowned. "It might not be new for you, but it's not something I signed up for. My job is to take care of patients, not play PR for a billionaire." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, Lucas looked as though he might argue. But then he sighed, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "You're right," he said finally. "I shouldn't have put you in that position. I just—" He paused, searching for the right words. "I'm not used to relying on other people. It's not something I know how to do." The admission caught Caroline off guard. It was the most honest thing he'd said to her since they'd met. She softened, taking a seat in the chair across from him. "Well, maybe it's time to start," she said gently. "You don't have to handle everything alone." Lucas's gaze shifted to the skyline outside, his expression pensive. Easier said than done. Before Caroline could respond, a sharp knock at the door interrupted them. The door opened a fraction, and Ruth Sinclair stepped inside, her presence commanding as always. She was dressed in a sleek black suit, her hair pulled back into a severe bun. Her eyes swept over the room, landing on Caroline with thinly veiled disapproval. "I hope I'm not interrupting," Ruth said, though her tone suggested she didn't care either way. Caroline stood, instinctively positioning herself between Ruth and Lucas. "We were just finishing up," she said, her voice calm but firm. Ruth arched an eyebrow, her lips curving into a cold smile. "How professional of you, Miss Carter. But I think I'll have a word with my brother now, if you don't mind." Lucas, who had remained silent until now, leaned back in his chair, his expression darkening. "Whatever you have to say, Ruth, you can say it in front of her." Ruth's smile faltered, but she recovered quickly, her gaze narrowing. "This isn't a family discussion," she said sharply. "It's business, and it's private." Lucas's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching at the corner. Caroline stays. For a moment, Ruth looked as though she might argue, but then she let out an exasperated sigh. "Fine," she said, stepping fully into the room and closing the door behind her. "But don't say I didn't warn you." Caroline felt a knot form in her stomach as Ruth crossed the room, her heels clicking against the tile floor. Whatever was about to happen, she had a feeling it wouldn't end well. Ruth stopped in front of Lucas, her sharp eyes fixed on him like a predator sizing up its prey. She folded her arms, her posture rigid. "Lucas, this charade has gone on long enough. You're staying in this hospital, hiding from the world, while everything you've built teeters on the edge of collapse." "I'm not hiding," Lucas replied evenly, though his voice carried an edge. "I'm recovering. Or does that not fit into your carefully constructed narrative?" Ruth's lips tightened. "Recovering? From what? A few scratches? Meanwhile, the board is growing restless. Investors are asking questions. They're starting to wonder if you're still capable of leading." Lucas's expression hardened. "Is that what this is really about? You're worried about what the board thinks? Or are you more concerned about your own position?" Ruth stepped closer, her tone lowering to something icy and cutting. "You're my brother, and I've always looked out for you, whether you realize it or not. But your behavior is reckless. The press is already spinning this into a circus, and now you've dragged her into it." She shot a pointed glance at Caroline, who stood silently by the door. Caroline bristled under Ruth's gaze, but held her ground. "I haven't done anything but my job," she said firmly. "If you have a problem with me, take it up with hospital administration, not him." Ruth ignored her, turning back to Lucas. "Do you really think staying here, mingling with the help, is going to solve anything? You're wasting time when you should be controlling the narrative, not becoming it." Lucas's patience snapped. He rose from his chair, towering over Ruth as he stepped forward. "Don't talk about her like that," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "And don't pretend this is about me or the company. This is about you, Ruth. It's always about you." Ruth's composure cracked, her mask of cold indifference slipping for just a moment. "You're blind, Lucas," she hissed. "Everything I've done has been for you, for the family. While you're here wallowing in self-pity, I'm the one cleaning up your mess." Lucas laughed bitterly. "Cleaning up my mess? Is that what you call betraying me at every turn? Leaking private information to the press? Undermining me with the board? Don't stand there and act like a martyr, Ruth. We both know where your loyalties lie." The room fell into a tense silence, the air heavy with unspoken resentment. Caroline felt like an intruder in a battle she didn't fully understand, but she couldn't bring herself to leave. There was too much at stake. Finally, Ruth stepped back, her expression icy once more. "You think you're so clever, don't you?" she said, her voice low and venomous. "But one day, Lucas, you're going to realize just how much you've thrown away, and when that day comes, don't expect me to be there to pick up the pieces." She turned on her heel, her heels clicking sharply as she strode to the door. She paused briefly, glancing over her shoulder. "Good luck with your little rebellion. You're going to need it." With that, she disappeared into the hallway, leaving the door ajar behind her. Lucas let out a slow, measured breath, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Caroline hesitated, unsure whether to speak, but the storm brewing in his expression compelled her to break the silence. "Lucas," she said softly, stepping closer. "Are you okay?" He shook his head, his jaw tight. "She's right about one thing," he muttered, his voice bitter. "I've been running from this for too long." Caroline frowned, confused. Running from what? Lucas looked at her, and for the first time she saw the raw pain in his eyes. "The truth," he said simply. "About her, about the company, about everything. But if she thinks I'm just going to roll over and let her win, she's wrong." There was a steeliness in his voice now, a determination that hadn't been there before. Caroline felt a spark of hope, though she knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. "What are you going to do?" she asked carefully. Lucas's gaze hardened, his fists unclenching as he straightened his posture. "I'm going to fight back," he said, "starting with the board. It's time I took control of my life again." Caroline nodded, a flicker of admiration stirring in her chest. "If you're serious about that, you're going to need help," she said. "And I'm not just talking about lawyers or PR people. You need someone who's willing to stand by you, even when things get messy." Lucas met her eyes, his expression softening slightly. "And you're offering?" Caroline smiled faintly. "I'm just saying, don't underestimate the value of having someone in your corner." For the first time that day, Lucas's lips curved into a small, genuine smile. "Noted," he said quietly. The tension in the room began to ease, but Caroline knew the challenges ahead would only grow. As she left Lucas's room, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was a turning point, not just for him, but for both of them. Caroline pushed open the door to the staff lounge, her mind still churning with the aftermath of Ruth's visit. She grabbed a cup of coffee, hoping the bitter warmth would steady her nerves. Ruth's words had been cutting, and though they weren't directed at her, Caroline couldn't shake the feeling that Lucas's sister saw her as an obstacle, something to be brushed aside or used as leverage. "Rough day." Janet's voice broke through her thoughts. She slid into the seat across from Caroline, a curious look on her face. Caroline sighed, cradling her coffee cup. "You could say that. Ruth Sinclair showed up earlier." Janet let out a low whistle. "The infamous Ice Queen herself, huh? How'd that go?" "About as well as you'd expect," Caroline muttered. "She's convinced Lucas is making a mistake by staying here, and I'm pretty sure she sees me as part of the problem." Janet raised an eyebrow. "Well, she's not wrong about one thing." Caroline shot her a sharp look, but Janet held up her hands in mock surrender. "Relax. I just mean, you are part of the reason he's staying. Whether you realize it or not, you're the first person who's gotten through to him in years. That probably scares the hell out of her." Caroline frowned, her mind drifting back to Lucas's determined expression when Ruth left. "He's not the easiest person to get through to," she admitted, "but I think he's starting to realize he can't keep running from everything." "Good," Janet said firmly, "because if he's serious about fighting back, he's going to need people in his corner. And like it or not, you're one of them now." The words settled heavily on Caroline's shoulders. She didn't know when her role as Lucas's nurse had started to blur into something more, but there was no denying it anymore. Whether it was her sense of duty or something deeper, she couldn't walk away now. Her thoughts were interrupted by the buzz of her pager. She glanced at it and saw Lucas's room number flashing on the screen. Her heart quickened. "Looks like duty calls," she said, standing. Janet gave her an encouraging nod as she left. When Caroline arrived at Lucas's room, she found him pacing near the window, his expression tense. He turned as she entered, his movements abrupt. "We need to talk," he said without preamble. Caroline set her clipboard down and crossed her arms. "All right. What's on your mind?" Lucas hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. For a moment he seemed almost vulnerable, but when he looked up again, there was a fire in his eyes. "Ruth's right about one thing," he said. "I can't afford to stay on the sidelines anymore. If I'm going to protect what I've built, I need to act." Caroline nodded slowly, sensing the weight of his words. "And how do you plan to do that?" Lucas ran a hand through his hair, the frustration evident in his movements. "I'm going to start by confronting the board. Ruth's been playing them against me for years, but I still have leverage. I can turn this around." "You sound like you've already made up your mind," Caroline said, studying him carefully. "What do you need from me?" Lucas hesitated again, his expression softening. "I need someone I can trust," he said quietly. "Someone who won't sugarcoat things or back down when it gets hard." Caroline's chest tightened at the sincerity in his voice. "Lucas, I'm not a strategist or a lawyer. I'm just a nurse. And yet, you're the only person who's stood by me without asking for anything in return," Lucas countered. "That's worth more than you realize." The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of his words settling between them. Finally, Caroline spoke, her voice steady. "If you're serious about this, you need to be prepared. Ruth isn't going to back down easily." Lucas's jaw tightened. "I know," he said, "but for the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm ready to face her." Caroline nodded, a flicker of hope stirring in her chest. "Then let's figure out the next step." Lucas gestured for Caroline to sit as he moved toward the small table by the window. On it sat a sleek laptop, its screen glowing softly with what appeared to be a financial dashboard. Caroline's eyes scanned the intricate graphs and figures, though their meaning escaped her. "This is what Ruth has been working on," Lucas began, pointing to the screen. "She's been manipulating the numbers to make it look like the company is underperforming. It's subtle, but effective enough to make the board question my decisions." Caroline frowned. "That's illegal, isn't it?" "Technically, she's staying just within the lines," Lucas admitted, his tone bitter. "But the intent is clear: erode my credibility until the board sees her as the only viable leader." He tapped a few keys, pulling up another set of data. "I've spent the last few days piecing this together. If I can present it to the board, it'll prove she's been misrepresenting the company's performance." Caroline leaned closer, her interest piqued. "So, what's stopping you?" Lucas hesitated, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. "Timing," he admitted. "If I move too soon, she'll find a way to discredit me before I've had a chance to show this to the right people. And if I wait too long—" He trailed off, his jaw tightening. "She'll win," Caroline finished for him. He nodded. "Exactly." Caroline's mind raced as she considered the situation. It was clear Lucas was caught in a delicate balancing act, one wrong move away from losing everything. "You said earlier that you're ready to face her," she said carefully, "but it sounds like you're still hesitating." Lucas looked at her, his expression conflicted. "I've always been cautious, Caroline. It's what's kept me ahead for so long. But Ruth knows me too well. She's counting on my hesitation." Caroline leaned back in her chair, her gaze steady. "Then stop hesitating. You've already taken the first step by gathering this information. The next step is making sure you have the right people backing you when you present it." Lucas arched a brow. "And how do you suggest I do that?" "You've built this company," Caroline said firmly. "There are people who believe in you, Lucas. People who've seen what you're capable of. Start with them. Talk to the board members who aren't under Ruth's thumb. Show them this data. Convince them before she has a chance to spin it." Lucas's lips quirked into a faint smile. "You make it sound simple." "It's not," Caroline admitted, "but it's necessary." For a moment, Lucas didn't respond. He stared at the laptop screen, the glow reflecting in his eyes. Then he closed the lid with a decisive click and stood. "You're right," he said. "No more waiting." Caroline felt a surge of relief, though she knew the battle was far from over. "What's your next move?" "I'm meeting with one of the board members tomorrow," Lucas said. "A neutral party who hasn't fully aligned with Ruth yet. If I can get him on my side, it'll set the tone for the rest of the board." Caroline nodded, impressed by his resolve. "Good. And in the meantime?" "In the meantime," Lucas said, his tone lighter now, "I'll do what I should have done from the start. Trust that I don't have to fight this alone." The sincerity in his words caught Caroline off guard, and for a moment she was at a loss for how to respond. But then she smiled, a small but genuine expression. "You don't," she said simply. As she left the room, Caroline couldn't help but feel a sense of cautious optimism. Lucas was finally taking control, and though the path ahead would be fraught with challenges, she believed he had the strength to face them. What she didn't realize was just how much her own role in this fight was about to grow. Caroline stepped out of Lucas's room and leaned against the wall, the weight of everything that had transpired pressing down on her. The quiet determination in his voice had been reassuring, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the road ahead was going to test him, and her, more than either of them realized. She rubbed her temples, willing away the tension when Janet appeared at the end of the hallway. "You look like you've been through a war," Janet said, her tone light, but her eyes filled with concern. Caroline gave a half smile. "Something like that. Lucas is complicated." Janet raised an eyebrow. "That's putting it mildly. What's he plotting now?" "He's planning to confront Ruth and the board," Caroline said, her voice low. "He's gathering evidence to prove what she's been doing, but it's risky. He knows it, and so do I." Janet whistled softly, crossing her arms. "That's a big gamble. You think he's ready for it?" Caroline hesitated, thinking back to the moments they'd shared, the vulnerability he'd shown, the determination in his eyes. "I think he's more ready than he's been in a long time," she said finally. "But that doesn't mean it's going to be easy." Janet studied her for a moment before smirking. "You care about him, don't you?" Caroline opened her mouth to protest, but the words caught in her throat. Did she care about Lucas? Yes, but it wasn't that simple. She admired his resilience, his willingness to fight back, even when it would have been easier to walk away. But there was also a connection between them, one she couldn't quite define, something unspoken but undeniably real. "It's not like that," she said, though the words felt hollow. "I just want to help." "Uh-huh," Janet said, clearly unconvinced. "Well, whatever it is, just be careful. Getting too close to someone like Lucas Sinclair has a way of complicating things." Caroline nodded, though she wasn't sure what too close even meant anymore. With a quick goodbye, she made her way to the nurses' station, determined to refocus on her work. The day passed in a blur of routine tasks and quiet moments of introspection. By the time her shift ended, the hospital had settled into its usual nighttime rhythm. Caroline was gathering her things to leave when a soft knock at the door of the break room caught her attention. She turned to find Lucas standing there, his expression uncharacteristically hesitant. "Lucas," she said, surprised. "What are you doing here? It's late." "I needed to talk to you," he said, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. "Do you have a minute?" Caroline set her bag down, motioning for him to sit. "What's on your mind?" Lucas hesitated, his hands resting on the back of a chair as he searched for the right words. "I've been thinking about what you said earlier, about not fighting this alone, and you're right. But if I'm going to do this, I need to know something." Caroline tilted her head, her curiosity piqued. "What is it?" Lucas met her gaze, his expression serious. Why are you helping me? You've gone above and beyond what any nurse would do, and I can't figure out why." The question caught Caroline off guard, but she didn't look away. She took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "Because I see someone who's been carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders for too long. Someone who's been let down by the people who were supposed to support him. And because I think you're capable of so much more than you give yourself credit for." Lucas's eyes softened, and for a moment, the guarded wall he kept so firmly in place seemed to crack. "That's more faith than I deserve," he said quietly. Caroline smiled faintly. "Maybe, but I'm willing to bet on you anyway." Lucas exhaled a soft laugh, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. "Thank you," he said, his voice sincere, "for everything." "Don't thank me yet," Caroline replied, her tone light. "The hard part hasn't even started." Lucas gave a small nod, as if acknowledging the storm ahead. He sat down across from Caroline, the weight of his thoughts evident in the way he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between them. It wasn't awkward, though. It was the kind of silence that carried meaning, an unspoken understanding of the battles yet to come. "Tomorrow's the meeting with the board," Lucas said finally, breaking the quiet. "It's the first real chance I'll have to present the data I've collected. If it goes well, I might start to turn the tide. If it doesn't—" Caroline leaned forward slightly, her gaze steady. "It will go well," she said firmly. "You've done the work. You know the truth, and you have the evidence to back it up. The board would be foolish not to see that." Lucas gave her a faint smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "It's not the board I'm worried about," he admitted. "It's Ruth. She knows me better than anyone. She knows how to push my buttons, how to twist the narrative in her favor. If she senses even the slightest hesitation, she'll use it against me." "Then don't give her the chance," Caroline said simply. "Be confident. Be clear. And most importantly, don't let her control the narrative. This is your story, Lucas, not hers." Her words seemed to resonate with him, and he straightened in his seat, the uncertainty in his expression giving way to something more resolute. "You make it sound so simple," he said, a hint of humor in his voice. "It's not," Caroline admitted, "but that doesn't mean it's impossible." Lucas studied her for a moment, as if trying to decipher what it was about her that made her so steadfast. "You're different. You know that?" he said softly. "Most people would have walked away by now. But you're still here." Caroline shrugged, her lips curving into a small smile. "Maybe I just like a challenge." Lucas chuckled, the sound low and warm. "Well, you've definitely found one with me." The moment was interrupted by the distant chime of the hospital's intercom, a reminder of the world outside their quiet bubble. Lucas glanced at the clock on the wall, then stood, his movements deliberate and measured. "I should let you get home," he said, his tone lighter now. "It's been a long day, and tomorrow's going to be even longer." Caroline nodded, standing as well. "Get some rest," she said. "And remember, you've got this." Lucas paused at the door, looking back at her with an expression that was equal parts gratitude and determination. "Good night, Caroline," he said, his voice carrying an unexpected warmth. "Good night, Lucas," she replied. As the door closed behind him, Caroline sat back down, her thoughts swirling. She had no doubt that Lucas was ready to face the challenges ahead, but she couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in her gut that Ruth wasn't done yet. The battle might have just begun, but the stakes were higher than ever. She gathered her things and headed out into the cool night air, her mind replaying their conversation. For all his strength and determination, Lucas was still human, still vulnerable in ways he probably didn't even realize. and for reasons she couldn't fully explain, she felt compelled to stand by him, no matter how messy things got. The next day would mark a turning point for both of them. Caroline didn't know what lay ahead, but one thing was certain: she wasn't backing down. The conference room at Sinclair Tech was bathed in cool, sterile light, its minimalist design reflecting the efficiency and precision Lucas had always prided himself on. But as he stood near the head of the long, polished table, he felt an unfamiliar tightness in his chest. It wasn't fear, exactly, but the weight of knowing this meeting could define the future, not just of his company, but of everything he had worked to build. Board members began filtering into the room, their conversations muted, but filled with an undercurrent of curiosity and tension. Lucas had deliberately kept the agenda vague, knowing that if Ruth had caught wind of his intentions, she would have found a way to derail the meeting before it began. He couldn't afford any missteps. Caroline had offered to accompany him for moral support, but he had declined. As much as he valued her presence, this was a battle he needed to fight on his own. Still, knowing she believed in him had given him a sense of steadiness that he hadn't felt in years. "Good afternoon, everyone," Lucas said, his voice cutting through the low hum of conversation as the last of the board members took their seats. "Thank you for coming on short notice." The room quieted, and all eyes turned to him. He took a moment to meet their gazes, drawing strength from the confidence Caroline had instilled in him. Ruth was seated near the far end of the table, her expression composed, but her eyes sharp and calculating. Lucas could feel her watching him, waiting for any sign of hesitation. "I've called this meeting because there are some issues that need to be addressed," Lucas continued. "Over the past several months, I've noticed discrepancies in the company's financial reports, discrepancies that paint a picture of instability where none exists." A ripple of surprise moved through the room. Ruth's expression didn't falter, but Lucas could see the faint tightening of her jaw. "I've conducted my own analysis," Lucas said, clicking a remote to display a series of charts and data on the screen behind him. "What I've found is that certain reports have been manipulated, subtly but deliberately. These inaccuracies have sown doubt among investors and the board, and I believe they've been used to undermine my leadership." Murmurs erupted around the table, and Ruth leaned back in her chair, her lips curving into a small, unreadable smile. "Those are serious accusations, Lucas," she said smoothly. "Do you have evidence to support them?" Lucas turned to her, his gaze steady. "I do." He clicked the remote again, pulling up detailed logs of email correspondence and report modifications. This data shows exactly when and how these changes were made, and it wasn't just an oversight. It was intentional. The room fell silent as the board members studied the data. Lucas could see the doubt beginning to form in some of their expressions, but he pressed on. "I understand that these are significant claims," he said, "and I don't make them lightly. But if we don't address this now, the damage to the company and to our credibility will only grow." Before anyone could respond, Ruth leaned forward, her voice cool and measured. "This is a fascinating theory, Lucas. But you're implying that someone within the company, someone with access to sensitive information, has been acting against its interests. Are you suggesting that I'm responsible?" Lucas held her gaze, the tension between them thick enough to cut. "I'm saying the data speaks for itself," he replied, "and I'm asking the board to review it independently to determine the truth." Ruth's smile faltered for just a moment before she recovered, her tone turning sharp. "Or perhaps this is just another one of your desperate attempts to shift blame. After all, you've been distracted lately, hiding in a hospital while the rest of us keep the company running." Lucas felt a flicker of anger, but kept his voice calm. "I've been working to recover from an accident," he said evenly. "And in the process, I've realized just how much this company means to me. That's why I'm here. To protect it. The tension in the room was palpable as the board members exchanged glances. Lucas knew he had planted a seed of doubt, but whether it would take root depended on what happened next. One of the senior board members, an older man named Gregory Hall, cleared his throat and leaned forward. He had a reputation for being level-headed and pragmatic, someone Lucas hoped might act as a stabilizing voice. "Lucas," Gregory began, his tone measured, "this is certainly a lot to take in. If what you're saying is true, it warrants serious investigation, but accusations like this can't be taken lightly. Have you considered the potential fallout if this information is released prematurely?" "I have," Lucas replied, meeting Gregory's gaze. "That's why I've only shared it here with the board. My intention isn't to damage the company's reputation. It's to protect it. But doing nothing will only allow the situation to fester." Another board member, a woman named Evelyn Crane, nodded thoughtfully. "He has a point. If the numbers have been tampered with, we need to address it before it becomes a public issue. The longer we wait, the harder it will be to control the narrative." Ruth's smile tightened, and she interjected smoothly. "Of course, we should investigate any concerns, but let's not jump to conclusions based on incomplete data. Lucas has been under a great deal of stress lately. It's possible he's misinterpreted the numbers." "I haven't misinterpreted anything," Lucas said sharply, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "The data is clear. And Ruth, you know as well as I do that these changes didn't happen by accident." Ruth's gaze turned icy, her composure cracking just enough for Lucas to see the tension beneath. "Careful, Lucas," she said, her voice low but laced with warning. "Throwing around baseless accusations won't help your case." Lucas didn't waver. "They're not baseless. And if the board reviews the evidence, they'll see that." Gregory raised a hand, cutting through the rising tension. "Enough," he said firmly. "Lucas, you've presented some compelling points, but this isn't something we can decide on in a single meeting. I propose that we form an independent committee to review the data and determine the validity of these claims." Evelyn nodded in agreement. "That seems reasonable. If there's merit to Lucas's findings, we need to act. If not, we can put this matter to rest." Lucas exhaled a quiet breath of relief. It wasn't a definitive victory, but it was a step in the right direction. "Thank you," he said, his tone steady. "That's all I'm asking for, a fair review." Ruth's expression remained impassive, but Lucas could see the flicker of irritation in her eyes. She wasn't used to being challenged, and the fact that the board hadn't immediately dismissed his claims clearly unsettled her. The meeting adjourned shortly after, and the board members began to file out, their conversations hushed and speculative. Lucas remained seated for a moment, gathering his thoughts. He had done what he came to do, but the hardest part was still ahead. As he stood to leave, Ruth approached him, her heels clicking against the polished floor. "Well played," she said, her tone cool and biting. "But don't think for a second that this is over." Lucas met her gaze, his expression calm but resolute. "I'm counting on it." Ruth's eyes narrowed, and for a moment it looked as though she might say more. But then she turned and strode out of the room, leaving Lucas alone in the silent conference room. When he stepped out into the hallway, Caroline was waiting for him near the elevators. She straightened when she saw him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of how the meeting had gone. "Well?" she asked, her voice filled with cautious hope. Lucas let out a long breath. "They've agreed to investigate," he said. "It's not a victory, but it's a start." Caroline smiled, the relief evident in her expression. "That's good. It's progress." Lucas nodded, but his thoughts were already racing ahead. He knew Ruth wouldn't sit idly by while the board examined the evidence. She would fight back, and she would fight dirty. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he wasn't fighting alone. "Thank you," he said quietly, his gaze meeting Caroline's. "For everything." "You're welcome," she replied, her voice soft but steady. "But don't thank me yet. The hard part is still ahead." Lucas chuckled, the sound low and almost self-deprecating. "Isn't it always?" As the elevator doors opened and they stepped inside, Lucas couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. The road ahead would be fraught with challenges, but with Caroline by his side, he knew he had a fighting chance. The evening air was crisp and cool as Caroline stepped into the hospital's courtyard, a welcome respite from the day's tension. She sat on a bench beneath a flickering streetlight, her gaze drifting to the quiet garden that surrounded the area. The meeting Lucas had faced earlier lingered in her mind, and though it had gone better than she'd feared, she couldn't shake the feeling that Ruth wasn't finished yet. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. She looked up to see Lucas walking toward her, his hands tucked into the pockets of his coat. He looked more relaxed than she'd expected, though the faint lines of exhaustion around his eyes betrayed the weight he was carrying. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked as he stopped in front of her. Lucas shook his head, a small smile playing at his lips. "Not exactly. Thought some fresh air might help." Caroline gestured to the bench beside her, and he sat down, his movements deliberate and unhurried. For a moment neither of them spoke, the quiet sounds of the night filling the space between them. "How are you feeling?" she asked finally, her voice gentle. Lucas exhaled a soft laugh. "That's a loaded question." Caroline tilted her head, giving him an encouraging look. "Try me." He leaned back against the bench, his gaze fixed on the stars overhead. "I feel relieved, I guess. Getting the board to agree to an investigation was a small victory, but I'd be lying if I said I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop." "She's not going to make it easy," Caroline said, her tone matter of fact. "But you knew that." "I did," Lucas admitted, "and I'm ready for whatever she throws at me. Or at least I think I am." Caroline studied him for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "You've changed, you know," she said quietly. "When I first met you, you were closed off, like you were carrying the weight of the world alone. But now, I see someone who's willing to let others in, someone who's fighting for what he believes in." Lucas turned to her, his eyes searching hers. "That's because of you," he said simply. "You've reminded me that I don't have to do this alone." Caroline felt her cheeks flush at the sincerity in his words, but she didn't look away. "You've done the hard work, Lucas. All I did was remind you of what you're capable of." He chuckled, the sound warm and genuine. "You make it sound so easy." "It's not," she replied, a small smile tugging at her lips. "But it's worth it." For a moment the world seemed to narrow to just the two of them, the weight of the day forgotten in the quiet connection they shared. Lucas shifted slightly, his hand resting on the bench between them. There was a hesitation in his movements, as though he were testing the waters. "I've been working on something," he said suddenly, breaking the silence. "Something I haven't told anyone about." Caroline raised an eyebrow, her curiosity piqued. "What is it?" Lucas hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, sleek device. It was about the size of a watch, its minimalist design unmistakably tied to his tech background. "This," he said, holding it up for her to see, "is a prototype I've been developing. It's designed to help people with sensory disorders, like mine, manage physical touch." Caroline's eyes widened as she took in the device. "Lucas, this is incredible." He smiled, though there was a hint of vulnerability in his expression. "It's still in the early stages, but if it works, it could change everything." Caroline reached out, her fingers brushing against the edge of the device. "Have you tested it yet?" Lucas shook his head. Not fully, but I was thinking maybe tonight. Caroline looked at him, her heart pounding in her chest. Are you sure you're ready? Lucas met her gaze, his expression steady. I think so, but I'd like you to be here just in case. Her breath caught at the weight of his words, and she nodded. Okay, let's try. The quiet determination in his eyes mirrored her own, and for the first time in a long time, Lucas felt a spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, the barriers he'd built could finally come down. Lucas adjusted the strap of the prototype around his wrist, the sleek metal surface glinting under the soft courtyard lights. Caroline watched intently as he tightened the device, her pulse quickening with a mix of anticipation and concern. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw clenched, as if bracing for something he couldn't fully predict. How does it work? She asked gently, trying to ease the moment with curiosity. It's designed to emit subtle sensory feedback, Lucas explained, his voice steady despite the nervous energy radiating from him. It creates a barrier of simulated pressure that tricks the nervous system into interpreting touch as non-threatening. At least that's the theory. Caroline nodded, marveling at the ingenuity of the concept. And if it doesn't work? Lucas gave a faint smile, though there was a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes. Then we find out how much pain I can handle. Her heart tightened at his words, and she reached out instinctively, stopping just short of his hand. You don't have to push yourself too far, she said softly. If it feels like too much, we stop. No questions asked. Lucas studied her for a moment, his expression softening. I trust you, he said simply. Caroline stepped back, giving him space as he powered on the device. A faint hum filled the air, the small lights on the device flickering to life. Lucas flexed his fingers, his movements deliberate as he adjusted to the sensation. For a few moments, nothing happened. Then slowly, he extended his hand toward her, the invitation clear but tentative. Caroline hesitated, her gaze flicking between his hand and his eyes. Are you sure? He nodded, his lips curving into a faint smile. I'm ready. She reached out, her fingers brushing against his palm. The contact was feather light, cautious, but it was enough to make Lucas inhale sharply. Caroline froze, her eyes widening with concern. Lucas? He didn't pull away. Instead, he closed his hand around hers, his grip firm but not overwhelming. His expression shifted, a mix of surprise and relief crossing his face. It's working, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I can feel it, but it doesn't hurt. Caroline's chest swelled with emotion, the significance of the moment washing over her. She tightened her grip slightly, testing the limits of the device. Lucas's breath hitched, but he didn't let go. This is incredible, she said, her voice thick with awe. Lucas, do you realize what this means? For you, for so many others. For us, he interrupted, his gaze locking onto hers. It means I don't have to be alone anymore. The sincerity in his words hit her like a wave, and for a moment she couldn't speak. The weight of everything they had been through, the struggles, the fear, the hope, culminated in this single, fragile connection. You're not alone, she said finally, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to form. Not anymore. Lucas smiled, a genuine, unguarded expression that transformed his face. He tightened his grip on her hand slightly, as if testing the boundaries of his newfound freedom. Thank you, he said quietly, for believing in me when I didn't believe in myself. Caroline felt her lips curve into a smile, a warmth spreading through her chest. You don't have to thank me, Lucas. You've done the hard part. You've let yourself feel again. As the night deepened around them, they sat in silence, their hands still intertwined. For Lucas, it was more than just a small victory. It was the first step toward reclaiming a part of himself he thought he'd lost forever. And for Caroline, it was proof that sometimes even the most impenetrable walls could be brought down, one touch at a time. The Sinclair Tech Gala was in full swing, the grand ballroom buzzing with energy as the city's elite mingled beneath glittering chandeliers. Waiters moved seamlessly through the crowd, balancing trays of champagne flutes and hors d'oeuvres, while a live jazz band played a smooth melody in the background. It was a display of wealth and power that had always defined Lucas Sinclair's world. But tonight felt different. Lucas stood near the edge of the room, his posture relaxed but his gaze sharp as he scanned the crowd. His suit was impeccably tailored, a subtle reminder of the control he'd regained over his public image. Yet, his mind wasn't on appearances. It was on the strategy he'd spent days refining. The gala was more than just an event. It was an opportunity to shift the narrative in his favor, to remind everyone of who he was and what he stood for. Caroline approached him, her presence grounding him in a way he hadn't realized he needed. She was stunning in a simple black dress, her confidence understated, but undeniable. Lucas felt a flicker of admiration as she stopped by his side, her gaze following his. "Nervous?" she asked, her voice low enough to keep the conversation private. "Not exactly," Lucas replied, though the tension in his shoulders suggested otherwise. "This is just a lot." Caroline nodded, understanding without needing further explanation. "You've got this," she said, her voice firm. "Just stick to the plan." The plan. Lucas had spent the week preparing his speech, refining his approach to ensure it would resonate with the right people. He'd made sure key board members would be present tonight, knowing their support could tip the balance in his favor. But there was still an unpredictability to the evening that he couldn't ignore, namely, Ruth. As if on cue, Ruth entered the ballroom, her presence commanding attention despite the crowd. She was dressed in a sleek emerald gown, her smile polished but calculating. Lucas watched as she began working the room, her charm disarming but her intentions clear. She was here to undermine him, to sow doubt before he even had a chance to speak. "Looks like she's getting started early," Caroline observed, following his gaze. Lucas exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening. "Let her. I'm not backing down." The band finished their song, and the room quieted as the MC took the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us tonight at the Sinclair Tech Annual Gala," he began, his voice warm and inviting. "Before we continue, we have a few words from our CEO, Lucas Sinclair." The applause that followed was polite but muted, the atmosphere tinged with anticipation. Lucas straightened his tie and stepped forward, his movements deliberate as he climbed the small stage. The lights dimmed slightly, casting a spotlight on him as he faced the audience. "Good evening," he began, his voice steady despite the slight tremor of nerves beneath. "Thank you all for being here tonight. This gala is a celebration of what we've built together, a company that thrives on innovation, integrity, and resilience." He paused, letting the words settle before continuing. "But as we look to the future, we must also acknowledge the challenges we face. Transparency and trust are at the core of who we are, and I believe it's time we recommit to those values." From the corner of his eye, Lucas caught Ruth's expression shift, her smile tightening as she realized where he was heading. It was a gamble, addressing the board's concerns so openly, but Lucas knew it was the only way to reclaim control. "I won't deny that the past few months have been difficult," he said, his tone measured. "Mistakes have been made, and doubts have been raised. But I stand before you tonight to affirm my commitment to this company and to each of you. Sinclair Tech was built on the foundation of trust, and I intend to rebuild that trust, starting now." The room was silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Lucas felt the tension in his chest ease slightly as he continued, confident in the direction he was taking. "And that starts with accountability," he added, his gaze sweeping across the room. "As CEO, I take full responsibility for ensuring our company operates with the highest standards of integrity. That includes addressing concerns and taking the necessary steps to move forward stronger than ever." The applause that followed was louder this time, a signal that his message was resonating. But as he stepped down from the stage, Lucas knew the real battle was just beginning. As Lucas descended the stage, the applause began to fade, replaced by the low murmur of conversations rippling through the room. He could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on him, some curious, others skeptical, and a few outright hostile. His speech had planted the seeds of doubt in Ruth's narrative, but he knew she wouldn't let it go unanswered. He spotted her weaving through the crowd, her emerald gown trailing elegantly as she moved with calculated precision. Within moments, she was standing before him, her expression cool and unreadable. "Well," she said, her voice honeyed but sharp, "that was quite the performance." Lucas didn't flinch. "It wasn't a performance, Ruth. It was the truth." Her smile tightened. "The truth? Or your version of it? You're playing a dangerous game, Lucas. One you might not be prepared to win." Lucas met her gaze, his voice steady. "The only danger here is underestimating me." Ruth tilted her head slightly, studying him. "You've gotten bold. I'll give you that. But boldness without strategy is just recklessness." She leaned in closer, lowering her voice to a whisper. "And we both know how reckless you can be." Lucas clenched his jaw, refusing to take the bait. "Enjoy the rest of the evening, Ruth. I'm sure you'll find a way to spin this, but the board deserves better than your manipulations." Before Ruth could respond, Caroline appeared at Lucas's side, her presence grounding him. "Everything all right here?" she asked, her tone polite but firm as her eyes flicked between the siblings. Ruth's gaze shifted to Caroline, her expression briefly flickering with annoyance before she regained her composure. "Just catching up with my brother," she said smoothly. "You must be the infamous Ms. Carter. I've heard so much about you." Caroline smiled politely, though her tone was edged with steel. "I'm sure you have." Ruth's lips curved into a thin smile, but there was no warmth behind it. "Well, Lucas," she said, turning back to him, "I'll leave you to your companion. But don't forget, this isn't over." With that, she swept away, disappearing back into the crowd. Caroline watched her go, her posture tense. "She doesn't play around, does she?" "No, she doesn't," Lucas admitted, his voice low. "But neither do I." Caroline turned to him, her expression softening. "You did well up there. I think you got through to them." Lucas let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "I hope so. But Ruth's not going to back down quietly. She'll try something, probably sooner rather than later." "Then we'll be ready," Caroline said simply, her confidence in him unwavering. Lucas gave her a faint smile, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. "Thank you," he said, his voice sincere, "for being here, for everything." Caroline nodded, her gaze steady. "You don't have to thank me, Lucas. This is your fight. I'm just here to make sure you don't forget why it matters." Her words struck a chord, and Lucas felt a flicker of hope reignite in his chest. The path ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he wasn't facing it alone. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of handshakes and polite conversations, each interaction reinforcing Lucas's resolve. He could see the shift in the room, the way the board members spoke to him with renewed respect, the way his employees seemed to stand a little taller in his presence. It wasn't a victory yet, but it was a start. As the night drew to a close, Lucas and Caroline stepped out onto the balcony, the cool night air washing over them. The city stretched out before them, its lights twinkling like a sea of stars. "It's beautiful," Caroline said, leaning against the railing. Lucas nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "It is, but it's also fragile. All of this, everything I've built, it could be gone in an instant." Caroline turned to him, her expression serious. "Then don't let it. Fight for it. Fight for what matters." Lucas met her eyes, a spark of determination lighting his own. "I will," he said firmly, "and I'll make sure Ruth knows it." For a moment, they stood in silence, the weight of their shared determination filling the space between them. Whatever came next, Lucas knew he was ready, and he knew he wasn't facing it alone. The early morning sun cast a soft glow across the city as Lucas sat in his office, staring at the laptop screen in front of him. The data files were all neatly organized, each piece of evidence a puzzle piece in the picture he was preparing to present. Today would be pivotal, his chance to finally tip the scales and hold Ruth accountable for her manipulations. Caroline had insisted on checking in before he left for the board meeting. She arrived at his office with 2 steaming cups of coffee, her expression a mix of encouragement and concern. "You're ready for this," she said, setting the cup on his desk. "You've done the work, Lucas. Now it's just about showing them the truth." He looked up, her words grounding him. "It's not just about the truth," he said quietly. "It's about undoing years of damage. Ruth's been playing this game for a long time, and people trust her. They trust the story she's built." "And that's why this matters," Caroline countered. "You're not just exposing her lies, you're reminding the board why they believed in you to begin with." Lucas gave a small nod, her conviction bolstering his own. "I just need to make sure everything goes smoothly. Ruth's not going to make this easy." "She never does," Caroline said with a faint smile. "But you're not the same person you were when this all started. You've changed. You're stronger now." Her words struck a chord, and Lucas felt a flicker of gratitude. For all his determination, it was Caroline's steady presence that had kept him grounded, reminding him of what was worth fighting for. The hours leading up to the meeting passed quickly. Lucas arrived at the Sinclair Tech headquarters to find the boardroom already bustling with activity. The air was charged with anticipation, each board member seated and murmuring quietly as they waited for the meeting to begin. Ruth was already there, her polished demeanor unshaken as she exchanged pleasantries with key allies. Her confidence was unmistakable, and Lucas knew she was ready to counter anything he threw her way. He took his seat at the head of the table, his posture composed despite the adrenaline coursing through him. Gregory Hall, the senior board member, called the meeting to order, his voice cutting through the chatter. "Thank you all for being here," Gregory began. "As you know, today's agenda is to address the concerns raised by Mr. Sinclair and evaluate the findings of the independent review." Lucas nodded, his gaze steady as Gregory turned to him. "Lucas, the floor is yours." Lucas stood, his heart pounding but his resolve unshaken. He began with a brief overview, summarizing the discrepancies he had discovered and the patterns of manipulation that had undermined the company's stability. His presentation was concise and precise, each slide of data reinforcing his claims. The room was silent, the weight of his findings sinking in as he spoke. But as Lucas neared the end of his presentation, Ruth interrupted, her voice sharp but controlled. "Lucas, while I admire your passion for the company, these accusations are baseless. You're reaching, trying to create a narrative that simply isn't there." Lucas turned to her, his expression calm. "The data speaks for itself, Ruth, and the independent review confirmed it." Ruth's composure faltered for the briefest moment, but she recovered quickly. "The data can be interpreted in many ways," she said smoothly. "But what concerns me most is your judgment. You've been absent, Lucas. Distracted. Are we really supposed to trust that you're fit to lead this company?" The room tensed, the board members exchanging uncertain glances. Lucas felt the pressure mounting but stood firm, his voice steady as he replied. "I've made mistakes," he admitted, "but I've also learned from them, and I'm here now, fully committed to ensuring this company thrives. Can you say the same, Ruth?" Her eyes narrowed, the challenge clear. The room fell silent once more, the tension palpable as everyone waited to see what would happen next. The silence stretched for a moment too long, the weight of Lucas's words hanging heavy in the air. Ruth's expression remained impassive, but Lucas could see the subtle shifts in her posture, the tightening of her jaw, the slight clench of her hands. She wasn't used to being put on the defensive, and the cracks in her composure were beginning to show. Gregory Hall broke the tension, clearing his throat as he looked between the two siblings. "This is clearly a critical matter, and I believe it's in the board's best interest to address these concerns thoroughly," he said, his tone diplomatic but firm. "We've reviewed the data provided by both parties, and the evidence supports the claims of financial discrepancies." A murmur rippled through the room, the board members exchanging surprised glances. Lucas felt a surge of relief, but he kept his expression neutral, knowing the fight wasn't over yet. "However," Gregory continued, his gaze shifting to Lucas, "this matter isn't just about numbers. It's about leadership and the future of Sinclair Tech. The board needs to determine whether the person leading us forward is capable of restoring trust and stability." The words struck like a blow, but Lucas nodded, his jaw tightening. He had expected this. Ruth's influence ran deep, and even with the evidence on his side, he knew he still had to prove himself. Ruth seized the opportunity, her voice smooth and confident as she addressed the room. "I couldn't agree more," she said. "This company deserves strong, consistent leadership, someone who has been present and engaged every step of the way. I've dedicated myself to Sinclair Tech, ensuring its success while Lucas recuperated." The pointed jab was subtle but effective, and Lucas saw some of the board members nodding along. He felt the tension rise in his chest, but before he could respond, Evelyn Crane interjected. "With all due respect, Ruth," Evelyn said, her tone cutting through the room like a blade. "Dedication means little if it's paired with deception. The data clearly shows that someone deliberately manipulated financial reports. That's a breach of trust, and it's unacceptable." Ruth's smile faltered, and Lucas seized the moment. "Thank you, Evelyn," he said, his voice steady. "That's exactly why I'm here, to rebuild trust, to ensure that Sinclair Tech operates with the integrity it was founded on." He turned to the rest of the board, his gaze sweeping the room. "I won't deny that I've made mistakes," he said, his voice calm but firm. "But I've learned from them, and I'm more committed than ever to this company and its future. Sinclair Tech has always been about innovation and resilience, and I intend to lead it with those values at the forefront." The room was silent again, but this time it felt different. There was a shift in the energy, a sense that Lucas's words had resonated. Gregory nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Very well," Gregory said. "The board will convene privately to deliberate on the next steps. Until then, I suggest we adjourn this meeting." Lucas nodded, his chest tight with a mix of anticipation and relief. As the board members filed out, he caught Ruth's gaze. Her smile was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating glare. She didn't speak, but the message in her eyes was clear. This wasn't over. Caroline was waiting for him just outside the boardroom, her expression a mixture of worry and hope. "How did it go?" she asked, her voice low. "They're deliberating," Lucas replied, his shoulders sagging slightly. "It's out of my hands now." Caroline placed a reassuring hand on his arm. You did everything you could. Now you just have to trust that the truth will prevail. Lucas nodded, though the uncertainty gnawed at him. Ruth won't go down without a fight, he said. But neither will I. Caroline smiled faintly. Good, because you've got people in your corner now, Lucas, and you're stronger than you think. Her words settled over him like a balm, and for the first time that day, Lucas allowed himself to hope. Whatever the board decided, he knew he wasn't facing this battle alone, and that made all the difference. The hours after the board meeting stretched endlessly, the uncertainty gnawing at Lucas's nerves. He paced the length of his office, his mind replaying every word of the meeting, analyzing every expression on the board members' faces. Gregory had promised a swift decision, but even a few hours felt like an eternity when so much was at stake. Caroline entered the office quietly, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. She set one on the desk and leaned against the doorway, watching him with a mixture of concern and understanding. "You're going to wear a hole in the carpet if you keep pacing like that." Lucas stopped mid-step, letting out a humorless laugh. "You think I'd have learned patience by now." "You've always been a man of action," Caroline replied, crossing the room to stand beside him. "Waiting doesn't suit you." "It's not just the waiting," Lucas admitted, running a hand through his hair. "It's knowing that no matter how much I've prepared, the decision isn't entirely in my hands. That's the hardest part." Caroline studied him for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "You've done everything you could, Lucas. You presented the truth, and now you have to trust that they'll see it for what it is." Lucas met her gaze, the sincerity in her voice grounding him. "You always seem to know what to say," he said quietly. "It's a gift," she teased, her lips curving into a faint smile. "But seriously, you're not in this alone. Whatever happens, we'll figure it out." Lucas nodded, the weight in his chest easing slightly. "Thank you," he said, his voice soft, "for sticking with me through all of this." Caroline shrugged, though there was a warmth in her eyes. "You've come a long way, Lucas. I wouldn't miss seeing how this ends." Before he could respond, his phone buzzed on the desk. Both of them tensed as Lucas grabbed it, his fingers tightening around the device. The caller ID displayed Gregory Hall's name. He hesitated for only a moment before answering, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "Gregory," he said, his tone neutral. "Do we have a decision?" There was a pause on the other end, followed by Gregory's measured voice. "We've reviewed everything thoroughly, Lucas. The evidence you presented was compelling, and the board has voted to remove Ruth from her position, effective immediately." Lucas closed his eyes, relief washing over him like a wave. "Thank you," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "Don't thank me yet," Gregory replied, a hint of caution in his tone. "This is only the first step. Rebuilding trust will take time, and there's still work to be done. But the board believes in you, Lucas. Now it's up to you to deliver." "I understand," Lucas said, his grip on the phone tightening, "and I won't let you down." As he ended the call, he turned to Caroline, his expression a mix of relief and determination. "Ruth's out," he said simply. Caroline smiled, her eyes shining with pride. "You did it." Lucas exhaled a long breath, his shoulders relaxing for the first time in days. "We did it," he corrected, his voice filled with gratitude. "But Gregory's right. This is just the beginning." Caroline stepped closer, her smile unwavering. "Then it's a good thing you're not afraid of hard work." Lucas chuckled softly, the tension in the room easing. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to hope for the future. As the news of Ruth's removal sank in, Lucas felt a mix of emotions swirl within him. Relief, certainly. Her stranglehold on the company had been broken. but also a sense of sobering responsibility. Gregory was right. This wasn't the end. The board's faith in him was conditional, and the road to restoring the company's reputation would be long and arduous. Caroline's voice pulled him from his thoughts. "What's next?" she asked, her tone even but filled with quiet encouragement. Lucas straightened, his gaze sharpening with resolve. "I need to address the company as a whole," he said. "The employees deserve to know what's been happening and what's going to change." "Transparency," Caroline said with a small nod. "It's what you promised." "Exactly," Lucas replied. "And this isn't just about repairing the damage Ruth caused. It's about creating a new culture, one that values integrity and accountability above all else." Caroline studied him, her expression thoughtful. "You've thought a lot about this." Lucas gave a small, self-deprecating smile. "It's hard not to when you're forced to confront your own mistakes. This company means everything to me, Caroline. But somewhere along the way, I lost sight of what it stood for. I let the wrong people take control, and it nearly cost me everything." "But you fought back," Caroline said, her voice firm. "You didn't let them win. That's what matters." Lucas nodded, her words bolstering his determination. "I want to make things right, for the company, for the people who've supported me, and for myself." Caroline's smile softened, a warmth in her eyes that made Lucas feel steadier than he had in weeks. "Then let's make it happen." The next day, Lucas stood before a packed auditorium at Sinclair Tech's headquarters. Hundreds of employees filled the room, their expressions a mix of curiosity and uncertainty. The events of the past few weeks had sparked countless rumors, and Lucas knew this was his opportunity to set the record straight. Caroline watched from the wings, her presence a steadying force as Lucas stepped up to the podium. The hum of quiet conversation faded as he adjusted the microphone, the weight of the moment settling over him. "Good morning," he began, his voice calm but firm. "Thank you all for being here today. I know there's been a lot of uncertainty recently, and I want to address that head-on." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "For too long, this company has been caught in a cycle of distrust and division. Mistakes have been made, by others, yes, but also by me. I take full responsibility for the role I've played in allowing that culture to take root." A murmur rippled through the room, but Lucas held steady, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "But today marks a turning point. The board and I are committed to rebuilding Sinclair Tech from the ground up, with transparency and accountability as our guiding principles. This isn't just about fixing what's broken. It's about creating something stronger, something we can all be proud of." Applause began to build, hesitant at first, but growing steadily as Lucas's words resonated. He felt a flicker of hope as he continued, his voice gaining strength. "This company's greatest asset has always been its people," he said. "And I want every one of you to know that your voices matter, your ideas, your concerns, your hard work. They're the foundation of Sinclair Tech's success. Together, we can build a future that reflects the values this company was founded on." The applause swelled, and for the first time in weeks, Lucas felt a genuine sense of optimism. He stepped back from the podium, his eyes finding Caroline's in the crowd. She gave him a small nod, her smile filled with pride. As he left the stage, Lucas knew the real work was only beginning. But for the first time, he felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, with Caroline by his side and a renewed sense of purpose driving him forward. The sun was setting over the Seattle skyline, painting the horizon in hues of gold and crimson. Lucas stood on the balcony of his penthouse, the crisp evening air brushing against his face. The city below buzzed with life, its lights twinkling like stars. For the first time in years, Lucas felt a sense of peace, a quiet confidence that the storm had finally passed. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind of change. Ruth's removal from the company had been swift, but not without its challenges. She had fought tooth and nail, but the evidence Lucas had gathered left little room for doubt. The board had voted unanimously to strip her of her position, and Lucas had taken the first steps toward rebuilding Sinclair Tech. Transparency initiatives were already in motion, and employee morale was beginning to recover. The company was healing, and so was he. "Enjoying the view?" Caroline's voice broke through his thoughts. He turned to see her stepping onto the balcony, a glass of wine in her hand. She wore a soft smile, her presence grounding him in a way he couldn't quite put into words. "I was," Lucas replied, his tone light. "But it's even better now." Caroline rolled her eyes playfully as she leaned against the railing beside him. "Flattery, Mr. Sinclair? I thought you reserved that for board meetings." Lucas chuckled, shaking his head. "I've learned a thing or two about sincerity lately." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the weight of the last few months lingering between them like a shared secret. Lucas glanced at Caroline, her face illuminated by the warm glow of the city lights. "I couldn't have done this without you," he said quietly, his voice carrying a rare vulnerability. "You stood by me when I wasn't sure I could stand on my own. That means more than I can say." Caroline looked at him, her expression softening. "You give me too much credit, Lucas. All I did was remind you of what you were capable of. The rest was all you." He shook his head. "Number it was us. You believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. That's not something I'll ever take for granted." Caroline smiled, her gaze dropping to the glass in her hand. "Well, for what it's worth, I think you've come a long way. Sinclair Tech is in good hands again, and you're finally seeing what the rest of us always knew. You're not alone." Lucas exhaled a soft laugh, his chest feeling lighter than it had in years. "It's strange," he admitted. "For so long, I thought I had to keep everyone at arm's length, that letting people in would make me weaker. But you showed me the opposite is true." Caroline tilted her head, her eyes meeting his. "So what happens next?" Lucas's lips curved into a faint smile. "Next, I keep building. This company, these connections, this life, and I don't run from it anymore." She nodded, a quiet pride shining in her eyes. "I think that sounds like a pretty good plan." As the city lights twinkled around them, Lucas felt a sense of completion, a chapter of his life closing and a new one beginning. But there was still one thing left unsaid, one piece of the puzzle he hadn't yet acknowledged. Lucas turned to face Caroline fully, his expression earnest. The weight of everything they'd been through together was reflected in his eyes, and for once he wasn't afraid to let his emotions show. "There's something I need to say," he began, his voice steady but laced with an edge of vulnerability. "I've spent so much of my life keeping people at a distance, convincing myself it was safer that way. But then you walked into my life, and you didn't just see through those walls. I think you tore them down without even realizing it." Caroline's breath hitched, her heart pounding as she met his gaze. She had seen Lucas transform in ways she hadn't thought possible, but hearing him speak so openly was a side of him she had never imagined. "I was afraid," Lucas continued, his voice soft but resolute. "Afraid of what it would mean to let someone in. Afraid of losing control. But you taught me that real strength isn't about shutting people out. It's about letting them in, even when it's hard." Caroline blinked, trying to keep her emotions in check. "Lucas, you've been through so much. You've fought battles most people would have run from, and you've come out stronger. You don't need me to tell you how far you've come." "Maybe not," he said with a faint smile. "But I need you to know how much you've meant to me. You're not just the reason I found my way back to this company. to myself, "You're the reason I want to keep moving forward." Caroline's chest tightened as the meaning behind his words sank in. "Lucas." He reached for her hand, his touch tentative but steady. "I don't know what the future holds," he said, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "But I know I don't want to face it without you." Caroline felt tears sting her eyes as she looked at him. The man who had once seemed so untouchable now standing before her, open and honest. "You're impossible, you know that," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. Lucas chuckled, his thumb brushing gently against the back of her hand. "So I've been told." She smiled through her tears, her heart full. "You don't have to face it alone. Not anymore." For a moment they stood there, the world around them fading into the background. The past, with all its pain and mistakes, no longer held them captive. They had both found something worth fighting for, not just in themselves, but in each other. As the evening breeze swept through the balcony, Lucas pulled Caroline into a gentle embrace. It wasn't rushed or uncertain. It was steady, filled with the promise of a new beginning. They didn't need words. The connection between them said everything that needed to be said. When they finally stepped back, Lucas took a deep breath, his gaze filled with determination. "Tomorrow we keep building," he said. "Not just the company, but this, whatever this is." Caroline nodded, her smile widening. "I like the sound of that." As the lights of the city twinkled around them, Lucas and Caroline stood